the elite classes of their urban societies, what they wanted to do was instill a sense of patriotism, visible patriotism. And men with right actions and right principles would be welcome into the embrace of the Union League. Those without, those who expressed sympathies for the Confederacy, would be shunned both socially and economically. Men would no longer have business with them. And so they would use this as a platform to encourage the proper respect for the national government among men of their peerage. But there's a broader story, too, to the mission of the Union League, one which is in many ways much more far-reaching, and that is their mission for what they would have called the masses. They also saw themselves as instructors of patriotism in ordinary Americans, which they felt was at a low tide at the end of 1862 and the beginning of 63. And so what the Union League had set about to do was to use its vast intellect and resources to essentially foster patriotism, foster support of the government. And they did this through a variety of channels. They used their considerable resources and wealth to help raise regiments of soldiers, both white and black. They also contributed to worthy causes, charitable and benevolent causes that aided soldiers, like the Sanitary Commission. They sponsored rallies, held parades, they contributed gifts to worthy officers, they bestowed flags, they created monuments, but they also did much more to influence public thought. One of the things they did, for instance, was sponsor through a publications wing a vast sort of industry of what we could call propaganda, but they saw as a persuasive form of rhetoric, pamphlets, broadsides, and other form of media that included illustrative material that essentially reinforced public notions of patriotism. So their goal was ultimately to spread this message broadly. And they used those publications and pamphlets and broadsides, and they actually shipped those things across the North so that they could be given out and distributed to instill in ordinary people what the proper patriotism was. Now, I should say that they were also controversial in their day, not merely because of their social standing. Democrats denounced them essentially as demagogues for the Republican Party. And it is true that those people who profess sympathy for the Democrats in the South would be shunned from their ranks. But ultimately, they would have argued that they were not partisans. They saw themselves as above party politics. And they argued, frankly, that in times of war, there should be no political parties. And so they were an important institution for trying to educate fellow Americans to a sense of patriotic duty that set aside individualism and individual rights on behalf of the nation. Tracy, perhaps now is a good time for questions.
Bob, thank you so much. What an eye-opening history lesson you've given us, and certainly there's a lot more to come. I've got with me Jim Mundy, and Jim is the director of the archival collections here at the Union League. Jim, we'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the Union League, about the Heritage Center, and then you can ask the first question.
Be happy to, Tracy. The Abraham Lincoln Foundation of the Union League was created in 1996 with the mission to protect, preserve, conserve, and educate both League members and eventually the general public about the history of the League through its art, archival, and library collections. And the jewel of our collection right now is one of the Boker-Leyland copies of the Emancipation Proclamation. Charles Leyland and George Henry Boker, both members of the League. The League supported the effort. They printed 48 copies. They were signed by Abraham Lincoln, William Seward, the Secretary of State, and one of Lincoln's two secretaries, John Nicolay, at the Sanitary Commission Fair here in Philadelphia in June of 1864. And that copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, one of 24 known to exist of the 48, is now on exhibit in the League's new Heritage Center, which we just opened last week and about which we are all very proud. And dedicated as part of that Heritage Center is a 1,000-square-foot room of exhibit space. There was a permanent exhibit on the founding of the Union League and its history through the 19th and 20th centuries called Love of Country Leads, which is our motto. There was a second exhibit. It's the first of 5 rotating exhibits over the next 5 years. It's called The Coming Storm. And the first exhibit deals with the years before the start of the Civil War and how Philadelphia was such a divided city and its loyalty between the North and the South itself. So that's what we do downstairs, and we're hoping everybody comes down afterwards to see it.
Oh,
Okay.
And your question for Bob?
My question, Bob, would be, you've given us a wonderful example of how dissent and loyalty existed throughout the country during the Civil War period, something I think that many people do find, new information. But can you tell us more about loyalty and dissent here in the city of Philadelphia, and specifically with the Union League of Philadelphia, because as you mentioned, dissent would not be tolerated by the League. So look forward to hearing about that. Okay? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your question. It's really a fascinating subject, the notion of Philadelphia during the war, because it's an unusual city in many respects because of its proximity to the South itself and because of its many connections to the South. And so among the elite class of Philadelphia, one of the things that worried them most was that those members of, say, the commercial community who wanted to maintain good relations with the South, they were worried that there was a great deal of Southern sympathy in the city. And during the 1860 election, there were actually a number of people who voted for Breckinridge, the Southern Rights Democrats. So Philadelphia was a city that had a strong backbone of Democratic opposition. And so the Union League especially knew that it had to deal with the problem in its own backyard. And so there was a particular impetus to deal with that. And also, of course, we know that over the course of the war, in urban areas, there was a particular sensitivity to the problems of dissent. We know, for instance, in New York City, we see draft riots broke out among the city's urban immigrant Irish poor. And Philadelphia also had its own populations, which were a sort of a tinder for that. So they were very much concerned with events in Philadelphia. But to their credit, they also had a long vision to look across the North in general. And they really did not neglect any portion of the North in their message of patriotism and their attempts to instill a sense of loyalty among the citizenry.
Woo. Thank you. This has been quite fascinating, Professor Sandel. My question has to do with the impact of religion in Pennsylvania. Quakers, Mennonites, who had a very strong influence on freeing slaves, but I wondered on the desertion rate in the state of Pennsylvania. Thank you.
The issue of the sort of pacifist sects or the conscientious objectors in the Civil War is a very prominent case in Pennsylvania. And although I didn't mention it yet, I see that as a sort of a separate category of opposition because theirs is a principled religious opposition. It is true, though, that they were a strong element of Pennsylvania society, and we do see a number of Quakers and various Pennsylvania German pacifist sects asking for some form of an exemption. The government did try to find a way to deal with them, to allow them to do alternative service or to pay commutation. So I would say that that is an important theme. But you also asked the notion of how religious scruples might have affected the desertion rate. And unfortunately, scholars probably couldn't give you anything that would be a straightforward answer, because desertion was categorized as a crime of intent, which sounds odd. You had to leave the army without the intent of returning. So naturally, when anyone was captured for desertion, they said, oh, I intended to return just a little bit later. The problem is they very seldom gave any reasons as to why they deserted. And so we don't have a lot of hard evidence that could give us definitive proof as to how many were deserting for religious reasons or for other reasons, from cowardice or problems at home or a variety of other things that would be perfectly explainable as well. So that's my sort of imagination to how we answer that question.
I'd like to ask what the legal ramifications of the dissent were, and if there were any famous cases or any spectacular or outstanding lawyers who represented both sides of the issue.
The issue of the legal ramifications, when we think about that, there are actually a number, because desertion, of course, was a crime that could be punished in military courts. But for civilians, there were forms of disloyalty that were also criminalized during the war. In other words, if you were to voice opinions or write them into newspapers that denounced the war effort or encouraged other people not to enlist, there were a variety of crimes of this nature that were defined as crimes and carried punishments of imprisonment or fines. And many of those cases were actually held, even though they might be charged against civilians, were held in military courts. And Democrats, of course, denounced this and said this was an example of Lincoln's tyranny and despotism. But the reality was that this was defined as a crime of the draft laws. It was put into the same code of law along with the law that created the Conscription Act. And so it was defined as a crime that essentially undermined the manpower. Now, you asked if there are famous lawyers, and I must say that although I'm familiar with a number of cases, I can't think of many of the famous lawyers, simply because many of these cases were not very popular cases, and so Democrats often had difficulty finding competent people to represent them. But it certainly was true that there were something like 14,000 cases in the Union against civilians on charges of disloyalty. And so it wasn't a small number, it was quite large. And in a number of cases, people were arrested, were found guilty, and were forced to serve prison sentences, including people from Pennsylvania.
This has been very interesting, by the way. But the question I had is, were there any Republicans who were considered deserters or weren't for the war, or is it just Democrats?
Well, thanks for asking, and the answer is, I think, yes. I mean, yes. And the reason is obvious. People deserted from the military or refused to go in when drafted for a variety of reasons. You know, the reality is that a person's political identity was one of those factors, but yes, most certainly there were a number of people who were Republicans who might have left service or failed to report when drafted. And now the problem is, if you were to ask how many, we can't know. So all I can say is tentatively that of course there would be some. Republicans would have said, of course, that it must be very few and people who should not be Republicans, but most certainly there were. At least in some number, yeah. Thanks for asking.
Well, we want to thank Bob and our audience as well for some incredibly perceptive questions that helped us to learn a little bit more. What do you say we go back now to Bob Sando for part 2 of Deserter Country? Here's Bob.
First, I want to begin by talking about the forms that opposition took. And the reality was that there was a vast spectrum of actions that could be deemed opposition. And the simplest ones, the ones that were most widespread, were what we might call simply deception or evasion. For instance, if the draft was one of the signature causes of opposition that people wanted to avoid, then one of the most common ways of opposing the war was by lying to the officers who came door to door to take the enrollment upon which the quotas and information for the draft was generated. And so it was not unusual that the thousands of enrollment officers selected by the Union government and spread throughout the various congressional districts of the Union, that they encountered a great deal of opposition. And they wrote about it with volumes of letters and reports to their superiors. So we know, for instance, that people lied when they came to your house and said, "How many men of military age do you have?" You might lie. If the limit of the draft age stopped at 45, a lot of people celebrated their birthdays a little premature. Another way, of course, was to try to willfully deceive officers by saying, for instance, that so-and-so doesn't live here anymore. They had moved on to some other town to parts unknown. And so there were various ways in which you could lie or attempt to deceive government officials to protect those who you loved. But there were other things, too, that we could clearly count as part of opposition. For instance, it was not unusual for there to be assaults on federal officers. And assaults, of course, were also along a spectrum of actions. Some officers said, for instance, that they were verbally assaulted, and not just by men, but by women, too, who they found across their path of duty. And it was true also that some of these assaults became violent. In fact, some officers were struck with anything from stones to sticks to eggs in some communities, and in other places they were even attacked. We also have in the records of the Provost Marshal's Bureau listings of dozens of people who were wounded or even a number murdered in the line of duty. And I found out in the course of my research that some of those people who were killed in Pennsylvania and were killed in the region that I focused on. So in addition to the notion of